Good. I know the window right behind me is shining in here and the shade broke, so I couldn't draw it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Glad you could make it to another great Salty Dog webinar. This is Barb Tyson, and with us today is Brian Flowers from Life Raft and Survival Equipment. Brian's webinar is titled Being Found, Epirbs, AIS and PLBs. I'm going to ask everyone to keep their video off and keep muted, but go ahead and type your questions into the chat box that I've opened. And we record all Salty Dog webinars, and I'll send out a link as soon as we have it ready. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's Brian Flowers of Life Raft and Survival Equipment, Inc.
Thank you, Barb, and good afternoon, everybody. So today's webinar, Being Found, Epirbs, AIS, PLBs, is an important topic and one that's very important to me. Before we can be found, we need to be seen, and we need to be heard, and hopefully we're afloat. So, there are a lot of different maritime distresses, whether you're taking on water, there's fire, man overboard, unconscious or sick person, as you see up here on the screen. We need a way of communicating to bring attention to ourselves. So some of the things that should be covered before we even talk about Epirbs, AIS, PLBs are just some of the ways that we do bring attention to ourselves and how we can communicate. So I put up a lot of slides, so I know since this will be recorded, you'll be able to go back and read some of the information. I try to keep it somewhat basic. There'll be a slide or two that has some good information that you'll want to review. If I don't say this again and again, I'll say it at least once, and that is a lot of people have safety equipment and they don't know how to test it. They don't know how to activate it. Be familiar with your equipment and be intimate, so you know how to use it in case of emergency, because when you need it in an emergency, we all have a panic factor in us. We want to be self-assured that we know what we're doing, and we want our crew to know what they're doing. So be aware of your equipment. There's pictograms right on flares. There's pictograms on PLBs, Epirbs. There's a lot of information. Read your manual when you purchase these things. Call and talk to whoever you bought it from and know how to use it. So I'm probably going to stress that more than once, and if I don't, I'd like to say it up front. So being heard and being seen can come in different forms. Whistles and bells, and we all know Mayday calls, and these emergencies are acted out on threes, so we're clear and concise that there is some kind of distress. We always want to be clear, speak clearly, act clearly, so people on the other end can hear exactly what we're trying to communicate. So signaling, it says it right here. You want to attract attention, bright or different, message of help. So there's a lot of signaling, whether it would be, we're going to cover some of that. And like I said, we have a lot of slides. You'll be able to go back and pause it and read it, look at it. And again, if you buy this safety equipment, the people that sell it to you, they're there for you. And don't ever be afraid to ask questions. So you have type of signaling equipment. And again, we're going to get into more in depth about AISs, Epirbs, and PLBs, but just an overview of some of the safety equipment that you could have in an abandoned ship bag or maybe in a life raft. Again, know how to use it. Signal mirror, laser flare, flashlights, hand flare, splashing. These are all active signals. So signals that require your participation. A passive signal is something that you can't necessarily control the results of, but spelling out SOS, as we see in the the picture here with the little flames uh, acting out SOS, releasing a dye marker or a streamer, and I have a slide that'll show somebody splashing in the water, a streamer, smoke. As you can see, this is a very visible, dense smoke that is very visible. And you have signal mirrors and flares. Again, this is some of the information I wanted to provide before we get in depth on the topic, because a whistle or a signal mirror, an inexpensive piece of equipment, ultimately save your life. So as I mentioned a couple seconds ago, treading water doesn't provide as much of a field vision as splashing does. So any of these things that you can do to grab someone's attention is always helpful. So again, as mentioned here on the left is a smoke, which is an orange dense smoke that's very, very visible. There's a rescue streamer right next to that. It's basically just a long orange material that can be more visible than splashing. It's pretty inexpensive. You have a dye marker, pretty common. They're pretty compact. They'll fit inside a ditch bag. So again, just reiterate that we're talking mainly about some signaling devices that are helpful and that you'll find on the boat or the ditch bag. This slide I'm not going to talk about too much because I just wanted to put it up there. Again, a lot of information here that you can pause and read through it. But basically, a soulless flare is going to burn brighter than a Coast Guard flare. It's going to work. Definitely beyond the expiration date. So a lot of people have soulless flares that are out of date and they're still going to work. Coast Guard approved flares, they might not burn as bright, burn as long, but understand again how it's going to work and look at some of the differences between the flares. Of course, you can always answer questions, but we're trying to get to the main topic of the discussion today, which is PLBs, Eperbs, and AIS units. Also, that's a lot of visual. You also want to be heard. So you have Mayday calling. When there is a distress, one of the first things you want to do is you want to go to your VHF radio. Making a Mayday call is a whole other topic that, none of the safety equipment really is straightforward. There's always something that supports something else. So it's a topic that we can cover for a lot longer than 45 minutes. But, just know your equipment, know how it works, which right here, be prepared, know how your equipment works, prepare the crew. That is so important to do because you may be the one who knows everything. You may be the person that's overboard. You may be the person that's injured. So a prepared, knowledgeable crew only benefit each other. So the best thing to do is to show that person where the Eperb is, where the fire extinguisher is, where the radio is, how to turn it to channel 16, which is an emergency channel. So these things are important. And again, making a Mayday call, you want to be clear and concise. We actually, if you want, let me know through email. If you don't have a Mayday poster, I have nice Mayday posters on waterproof paper. We'll send them out to Salty Dog participants. So the other part of the discussion that has to be talked about before, again, going on is man overboard equipment and retrieval. Of course, if you're overboard and you're signaling for how do you get back on board? So there's many, many devices. I've put out a few on the screen. So there's, if you are familiar with some of the products, Life Sling, you probably heard, man overboard modules, throw rings, emergency ladders to board the vessel. There's lot of different devices out there, and some races require certain things. So know your regulations, know what you're required to have, and inquire about man overboard equipment. And there's lots of it. So again, any expert would be able to help you through whatever your needs are. The next screen, it just keeps leading into man overboard. And a lot of people have life jackets. A lot of people have inflatable life jackets. You might also be wearing your foam PFDs or have foam PFDs below. Most of any device, a PLB or an AIS unit, will attach to a foam vest. When we talk about AISs in a little bit, we'll talk about how the inflated bladder will help to mechanically set off an AIS transponder. But one of the things about PFDs is you'll wear, I should say, inflatable PFDs. You'll wear an inflatable PFD, and you hope that it will go off, and you hope that it doesn't have any holes in its bladder and be able to sustain being in the water if you go overboard. So one important thing to do with a PFD is to maintain it. And we're, as a service station, which didn't really say much in the beginning about life raft and survival, but we service everything we sell. So we're a full service station, which the first slide had a picture of our shop. And since we service everything we sell, we see a lot of PFDs that they might work, they might not, they might have leaks in them. Some of the mechanisms that help set off a PFD might be expired or might be on the verge of inflating. So there are so many different mechanisms that set off an automatic inflatable life jacket. There are manual life jackets, and for the most part, every life jacket has a way of pulling a mechanical pull to inflate the life jacket. So the CO2 cylinder inflates the life jacket. But an automatic, so every life jacket will have a manual pull of some kind, whether or not it's an automatic or a manual. So an automatic life jacket could have an array of different mechanisms that set it off. One of the questions that is often asked is, should I replace my CO2 cylinder? So the CO2 cylinder is replaced or it lasts indefinitely. So it doesn't need to be replaced unless rusted, corroded, or used. So there's no refilling a CO2 cylinder for a life jacket. You're going to have either a secondary one on board, or you can orally inflate a life jacket. So understanding the mechanism of the life jacket is important. Replacing the components is necessary because you don't want a life jacket going off when it's not needed. So if you do get to that point, do you have a way of rearming it should it go off? So again, not the topic of discussion necessarily, but like I said, you can't really have a discussion about AISs and PLBs without talking about the main thing that's going to sustain life would be a life jacket in a man overboard situation. So, on the screen, you're going to see a lot of different inflators, and there are a lot of different inflators out there. It's not straightforward and easy. I tell people if they can come to Rhode Island and they can bring their equipment in, we can surely inspect it for you at a charge. We can surely help you, show you what to do. We can surely sell you the components. If somebody calls here, I'm going to ask you to probably take pictures and send it to me, or you can describe it. But as you can see, a lot of different inflators on there. The most important thing is your life jacket. You go overboard, you want that to work. A lot of people participate in seminars in which they go in the water and they inflate their life jackets to get a feel for it. But you can service your life jacket at home. Some of them are a little more complicated to fold up and some are straightforward. They practically fold themselves. So understanding the mechanisms that inflate it, making sure everything's in date, even taking, if you're going to do your own maintenance, which I suggest once a season before the season begins, take the cylinder out if you can. Some mechanisms you can't take the cylinder out, but take the cylinder out first, inflate your PFD. It's a small bladder. If it's going to leak, you're going to know it pretty quick. So there's an oral inflation tube. You would inflate your life jacket and make sure it holds air for a few hours. Again, if there's a hole in it, it's going to lose air pretty quick and pretty soft on you. There's not really any repairing a life jacket. We recommend around 10 years old or older, you're probably replacing it if you keep them in good shape. Because naturally, fabrics are going to lose their porosity and you're going to chafe it. If the CO2 cylinder is rusted, it can leave marks on the fabric in which a hole can develop. So again, I know I'm saying a lot of information here about PFDs, but you're wearing it, be assured that it's going to work. If you have any questions on any of this, of course, we'd be willing to help. So now to the main topic, and that is Eperbs and PLBs. So Eperb is typically a lot of ways that we say what an Eperb is and a Eperb is registered to the boat and a PLB is registered to a person. So a Eperb and a PLB differ in a few ways, but basically a PLB is a mini Eperb, so to speak. So they do the same general idea. So Eperbs and PLBs, and my assumption is always people have heard these terms and they're aware of what they are and mostly owned already. So some of this information, I'm almost assuming you know what an Eperb and a PLB is, only because it's such a popular term. And of course, can answer any questions at the end, should we have any. And I'm going to give you a general idea of what they are, even if you know what they are. So Eperbs and PLBs come in many shapes and sizes. Eperbs typically going to be a little bit bigger than a PLB because of how much longer an activated Eperb will last versus how long an activated PLB will last. I'm not sure that's even in the slide anywhere, but an Eperb is going to go off for 48 hours, and a PLB is going to go off for 24 hours minimally. So therefore, the battery is going to be bigger in a Eperb, and it's going to be bigger in structure as compared to a PLB, which will be a little smaller because it has a smaller battery. So both some commonalities here, which is this screen. PLBs, they're both PLBs and Eperbs are both GPS enabled for an accurate location. So the search area is very slim because it's transmitting a GPS coordinates. The McMurdo Eperb, which will be on the screen here in a minute or so. The McMurdo Eperb, as of now, they are the only company that has an integrated AIS transmission in their Eperb. So not only is it transmitting lat and long, it's also transmitting AIS. An AIS transmission, which we'll definitely see a little more examples of that later in the presentation. So an AIS, if I don't say this later, an AIS receiver is necessary. So a lot of the audience I'm talking to today will probably have a Class B AIS receiver as opposed to a Class A AIS receiver. Class A is for larger ships that need to transmit more information. And now Eperbs have 10-year batteries, and for the most part, user replaceable, where before they would 5-year batteries, you send them into a service station like us. And I'm still going to recommend to people that every 5 years, at least have someone test it that has the diagnostic software to test it, make sure that it is transmitting the proper signal, so you can be rest assured that the Eperb will do exactly what it says it's doing. So Epirbs and PLBs, again, you might have seen this out there. And again, with a slide, you can go back and look through it or find it online. But, essentially an Eperb or a PLB has what's called a UIN, a unique identifying number or unique identification number. And that's the only information that's basically transmitting that tells anybody who you are. So because you own an Eperb or a PLB with a UIN number, it's a 15 character ID code with numbers and letters, and that's what transmits. And that transmission of that UIN number is again only broadcasting that identifies you, and the GPS that's sending out is also, but back to the identifier, reason why they know who you are and what kind of boat you have, or how many crew on board, or if you have a life raft, what kind of communications devices you have on board, and your emergency contacts. The only reason they know all that from your UIN number is because you've registered your Eperb and you registered your PLB. And this is a free service. You go to beaconregistration.noaa.gov, but easy enough. If you need to register your Eperb, you go on Google and put in Beacon registration or Eperb registration, and beaconregistration.noaa.gov right up, probably the first choice. And you can create an online account and you put in the UIN number and some other information on the Eperb. You put in information about yourself, about your vessel, and your emergency contacts. And you want to register your beacon. Very important that you register your beacon. So again, they know who you are because they're able to take that UIN number and cross-reference it in a database and identify who you are. One of the first things they're going to do is they're going to go to your emergency contacts, and they're going to reach out to those emergency contacts, because if there's no need to deploy search and rescue, they're not going to. So ask those emergency contacts that you provide if the vessel is out, and if it's, at the dock, or, you're answering the phone, then they're not going to need to do that. Although, you probably want to check as to why your Eperb might be going off. So, it's something that happens very rapidly. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, when we talk about the AIS transponders, the Eperbs and the PLBs are a global system. So this is working globally up to a satellite, received, and deployment is ultimately what happens. And, when search and rescue is going to look for you, it's all hands on deck. Emergency radios are being utilized to try to find somebody in the area. Again, it's very rapid. It's very serious. You would not want to set off a PLB or an Eperb for any other reason other than the possibility of loss of life. Pretty much, it's an emergency beacon. It's not to be set off for reasons that aren't considered life or death. So just reading through this, easy enough. Signaling is not affected by the weather or darkness. It does transmit on a 406 frequency. There is always a 121.5 homing signal built into Eperbs. A lot of people think, hey, I thought the 121.5 was no longer valid. If you had one, it's illegal. To have only a 121.5, as they used to call them, a mini B, a couple different names, maybe 15 years ago, that signal alone is not monitored, but there is homing signal equipment on vessels, especially search and rescue vessels, that can home in on that 121.5. So again, it's acquiring GPS from satellites and it's broadcasting that, so that way they know your position. As we talked about a little bit, instruct all people on how to use the Eperb if there is a need for using the Eperb. So you want to make sure that everybody on board knows how to use it. So again, the pictograms on the units itself, a quick rundown of how to use your Eperb, reading through the manual. They come with a manual. It's not a difficult manual to read. There's not a lot. It's not very intricate, but there definitely is a manual that you should read through. We'll talk about testing an Eperb in another slide, but also remember, test the Eperb. A lot of people come to me or come to us and they say, I don't touch it. I've never touched it. I don't want to touch it. You should know how to test it. It's very simple to do. You can test an Eperb and a PLB once a month for the life of the battery. So you're not draining your battery by testing it. So it's a good idea to test your Eperb or PLB, especially before the season starts. Make sure it does what the manual says it's going to do in order to test it. So the second line, install properly. An Eperb there's a couple different ways an Eperb can come to you. You can buy an Eperb, either a category 1, which is an auto deployed. It'll come in a bracket, which there'll be a picture here in a second. So there's the middle picture down there is a category 1 auto deployed bracket. It comes with a hydrostatic release. If the vessel sinks, it can float free. To the left, far left picture, the McMurdo AIS unit, that'll be a category 2. And we'll come back to this slide in a second, but say that a category, well, it doesn't matter, either one, category 1 or category 2, auto deployed or manual deployed, it needs to be in the bracket properly, because magnet in the bracket that prevents the contact connecting setting off your unit. So if the unit is in the bracket, it's not going to set off if it gets wet, spray, cleaning boat. So in the bracket, it's not going to go off. If you can't fit your Eperb into your bracket, into your ditch bag, just make sure that the Eperb doesn't get wet. And the Eperb is a manual activation or water activation. And I say that later in here. And if I don't know that an Eperb can be water activated or manually activated, where a PLB is manually activated only. So again, the install properly, if it's in its bracket, it won't go off if it gets wet. If it's out of its bracket, it could. Just know that. I put in there, don't tie the lanyard off to the vessel. So if you can see the lanyard here, there's a lanyard that should come with any Eperb. You don't want to tie this off to the vessel. If the vessel sinks and this comes with it, underwater, this will not will activate, but it won't transmit, because the antenna, which this doesn't have one, I grabbed this at the last minute, the antenna, which would be on here, needs to have a clear view of the sky. These do float, and they float in the upright position. And you can tie this off to a life raft. You can tie it off to the ditch bag. You can tie it off to yourself. But this can float, which is fine, but you don't want to tie it to the vessel. Vessel goes down, this goes under, it doesn't transmit. So you want to keep it with you, keep the antenna vertical, and again, include in station bill assignments. Again, make sure if you're the person who is injured or overboard, that you have backup and people know what to do in case you cannot. So we talked about the Noaa registration and the importance of that and the information that you provide. So again, Google Eperb registration. It's going to come up, beaconregistration.noaa.gov. It just comes off the tongue for me because I've been saying it for a long time, but they're very helpful people there. So if you get stuck online and you can't create a online account for some reason, then they're very helpful. You can fax it. You can do it online. And if you get into a position where you have some questions, that they are extremely helpful. They keep your information tight-lipped, so when you register it, they're going to ask you for some information that you provided that will prove to them that it's your beacon if you're ever trying to do something. But please register your beacon. It's pretty straightforward. The we talked about the Cat 1 a little bit, Category 1, which is a float-free Eperb, comes in an enclosure, completely enclosed, has a hydrostatic release that gets replaced every couple years. You put that so if the vessel sinks, it's quote-unquote outside, so it can float free. And hydrostatic releases every 2 years. And the last thing we've mentioned already on this screen, that they replace the battery every 5 to 6 years on some old units, and the new units have a 10-year user replaceable battery. But again, I suggest testing it at a service station every 5 years. We charge $35-40 to test it against some computer software, and I would suggest still doing that. I mentioned in there to check after rough passages, make sure your Category 1 Eperb is still firm where it belongs, so the magnet lines up. Make sure your cover's on tight. Some of these newer cases have a rotating dial. You want to make sure that's locked in so your cover stays on. So a little bit about Eperbs versus PLBs. I know we really haven't talked about PLBs yet, but maybe the slides are out of order for a second, but it sort of does lead into PLBs. So we did mention that, let me just see here. So like I said, a PLB is basically a mini Eperb. It acts as an Eperb would, in that it transmits a UIN number, and they know who you are because you registered it. Now, something that would be of good for me to maybe put on here would be the different registration forms, and I did not, but you'll see on a Eperb registration form, it asks a lot about the boat itself. So the color of the boat, how many people on board, the boat name, what kind of electronics do you have, these kind of pieces of information, because it helps them help you. Emergency contact. So the only difference between an Eperb and a PLB's registration is on the PLB registration, it has a general use. What are you generally doing? Because these are small enough to take hiking and backpacking, so on and so forth, in addition to having them on your person or on your boat. So there's a comment section. I suggest to people who buy a PLB and are boating, which is mainly who I deal with, to put in there the color of your boat, how many people on board. If you have a life raft, in the comment section, it can only provide more information. So for those on a budget that say, hey, I want to spend a little bit less on a device like this, a PLB runs you around $350 compared to an Eperb, which is about $450. So it's not much of a savings. But as you can see, a PLB is a handheld device, good for, we're boaters here. So, good to put in your foul weather gear, put in your pocket, put in your life jacket accessory pouch if you have one. They can go inside life jackets, but as we'll talk about in a minute, a decision needs to be made whether or not you want to have a personal locator beacon on you or an AIS transponder. And I leave that decision up to you. One of the questions that's always asked, and I'll try to say now in case I forget, is there such a thing as a personal locator beacon and an AIS all in one unit? At the moment, no, but they are working on it. I heard 2021, but they said because of COVID, they still think 2021, but that remains to be seen. So anyway, back to Eperbs versus PLBs. I'll just read through it. PLB, as I mentioned, is manually activated, or PLB is manually activated, where an Eperb is water activated or manually, automatic or manually activated for an Eperb. The Eperb will float in an upright position where you have to make sure that the PLB's antenna is to the sky probably going to be holding it unless it's on your life jacket. The antenna, which I know I have a slide here, but the antenna of a PLB needs to be deployed. So there's many PLBs out there. There's many Eperbs out there. Again, know your product, read your manual. But I have an example of a PLB right here, not the one pictured. The one pictured on the PowerPoint is the newest ACR, but probably a lot of people have these. So the antenna is in here, you know, and I'm just taking this little switch out of here, or the little clip out of here, and then, you know, I am taking the antenna and unfurling it. And I don't know how easy that was to see or not, but you know, you can watch it again and play it in slow motion. But here's your, you know, your deployed PLB antenna. So you're going to want that to the sky. And in this particular model, you know, the activation switches are underneath the antenna. So it's not going to inadvertently go off, because as you see, as I put the antenna down and furl it around the unit, there's a plastic covering that's preventing it from accidentally going off. So again, know your PLBs, know how to deploy the antenna. Don't learn that when you need it. Read the manual, understand how to do it, understand how to test it. And so just to, well, I will talk about testing an Eperb, but in case I don't, so some Eperbs, again, read the manuals, but on this particular unit, and ACR is a very, very popular, well-marketed product, very good product, by the way. You know, I feel like it's a very good Eperb. You know, how do you test it? And here we have a test switch right here that you would lift halfway up like that, and then let it go back down. You don't want to hold it up too long. It's just a couple seconds. You go halfway up and back down. It'll run through, this is a dummy unit. They'll run through a series of tests, some LEDs, and it'll strobe at the end. And that tells me that it's self-testing. Now, if you ever wanted to use this Eperb in an emergency, you're going to lift this same test switch up, but go up and all the way over and till it goes off to the other side. And then probably having a hard time seeing that, sorry, but now it's on the other side. So, you know, in its normal position, and take that switch and lift it up. But there are other Eperbs out there. Again, know your equipment. It might not all do that. That's pretty popular with ACR. But now they have a new model that the test switch is on the front. So just like I said, guess I can't reiterate it enough. Make sure you read your manuals and understand your equipment. So I see the time is flying. So the activating the PLB, we just went through that. I'm going to go through this real quick, just so the slide is up there long enough to pause and read through at your convenience, because we haven't even gotten to AIS yet, but we did start a little late. So I'm going to take liberties and keep going. So just some PLB information. Again, activating the PLB requires accessing or allowing access to the switches that are underneath that antenna, which I just showed you a little bit. Then again, keep the slide up here for a second, read through that. Really don't need to get into that, getting into the activating too much, because we're going to leave it up to you to take care of that. So the testing the PLB and Eperb, again, just a lot of information that can be found in the manual. And just a pictogram here, deploying the antenna. In this particular PLB, like I said, there are other PLBs. I didn't bring a McMurdo with me. There's McMurdo PLBs that the antenna deploys from the top by pulling on a plastic cover. So we're going to get into AIS. What I like to say is AIS Emergency Transponder, because that's really what we're talking about. We're not necessarily talking about the AIS on your vessel, a Class A or a Class B AIS on your vessel, that is a receiver. And as we talk here, I just want you to also know that a VHF radio with integrated AIS can also be a receiver, but not all VHF radios are AIS receivers. So that can be a source of confusion, which I'm going to try not to confuse you, but just so you know, an AIS VHF radio can acquire the position, or not the position, I'm sorry, can acquire the communication of an AIS transponder. So an AIS transponder, emergency transponder, a little different than an AIS system on board. So we're going to talk about how it works and how to install it into a PFD. So I have up on here a few different brands. A lot of people have McMurdo or Canard, that's how I say it, and Ocean Signal. So these are some popular brands. I know there's more out there. I know there's different man overboard systems out there. These are the ones that we sell. These are the ones that I believe in and have focused on and have studied. So there are some different products. If these look familiar to you because you have them, then there are some differences. And so again, I'm not going to read through the verbiage I put up here. It's more for you to read through. So how the unit works, in the middle of the screen, it says MOB, that is an emergency transponder, that is going off and ultimately picking up a satellite and transmitting that back to the boat or any boat in the area with an AIS receiver. So it's important to know that any boat in the area between 1 and 7 miles, they say 5 to 7, I like to say 1 and 7, between 1 and 7 miles, anybody with an AIS receiver will see this incident. So just so you know, and just so I can reiterate, I can't drive it home enough, that a MOB1 transponder will affect anybody in the area with the equipment to do so. So a lot of people have the AIS units installed on their life jackets. So this is a mechanical system. It's not going to water activate. It's mechanical because you're wearing your PFD and you're going to have an AIS transponder in your PFD. And if it gets wet, it could go off, draining your battery and not serving the purpose it's really meant for, is to go off and to signal back to the boat if you're in the water. So it's mechanical. So as you can see on the left, I know it's hard to see, but on the left, you have your transponder and there is a black line that runs around the bladder. So it's a black line that runs around. So it's connected to the slider, and this piece right here is the slider. So that's going to slide off and it's going to activate the PLB the transponder, and I'll show you that in a second. And then a string is attached from the oral inflation tube, which, where's the camera here? The oral inflation tube, this connects onto that. This string wraps around the bladder and then reconnects to this unit. So like this, I'm trying to do it real quick for you here. So it'll be on the life jacket, like you can see it there, with the string wrapped around the bladder. And then the bladder inflates, and it basically will pull this slider, and then boom, there's the antenna. And now this is activating on your life jacket. So that's how you're going to install it on a life jacket. And a person goes overboard, and these are just person overboard procedures that you would follow. Person goes overboard, you have somebody spotting, constantly pointing to where that is. We talked about some man overboard equipment earlier, we didn't really touch on it, but the man overboard equipment, man overboard modules, Dan buoys, throw ropes, life slings, You want to get that stuff out to the person, have a spotter pointing to where that person is, press your MOB button. Don't wait for the electronics, the AIS transponder to start communicating from the life jacket. Takes a couple minutes before it acquires a position and sends it back to the boat. The old-fashioned spotter, press an MOB button on your multifunctional display to get that waypoint. And as this electronics is transmitting back to the vessel, every vessel is different. I shouldn't say that. I should say like they are, but I should say all electronics are different. So every multifunctional display might say something different. So on the upper left-hand one, you can see that usually it's a red circle with an X. If I didn't say that earlier, I think I said it to a person before I started here, but the round circle with an X is pretty much indicative of a AIS transmission, or so it could come through, as you can see on the left-hand upper picture, AIS-SART. The one in the lower right-hand corner comes through as an MOB, man overboard. So all electronics would act differently. So I always stress to know your equipment and to know how it would act on yours. So, a unit, an icon may appear differently. Sometimes you can reprogram your multifunctional display to show a different marker. So let's see. So yeah, before we, just want to see where we're at a little bit. Okay. So again, I can't stress it enough that an AIS emergency transponder will send out an AIS, and any vessel can see this marker on their multifunctional display as long as they have an AIS receiver. So that's pretty much like end of discussion on that part of it. The next part that gets a little more confusing is this particular unit that I showed you has and ACR has one as well, has a DSC feature as well. So it can call your VHF radio, but only your VHF radio. So if you program your vessel's MMSI number into the unit, it can transmit a DSC call back to your VHF radio, and your VHF radio will start alarming, and your VHF radio, if an external speaker is wired, can start alarming that, so people below know that something's going on. And again, knowing your equipment and knowing how it reacts with your equipment, your electronics equipment, knowing how it acts with it, you'll be able to know what that alarm might be. So I know there'll be questions. I know we're moving through this stuff rapidly because we're almost out of time, but we'll be able to take some questions here. So just an example of what my digit in the middle is what my VHF radio, which is not AIS capable. So I had to program the MMSI number into the unit in order for the readout. And you can put, so on your readout of your VHF radio, you can put a position of the boat, you can put a name of the person, whatever identifier you want to put in there that makes the most sense in the worst time. You can put that so your VHF radio shows that who it is or whatever you designate. The multifunctional display that we looked at earlier, where a red circle with an X will come through, that's the only identifier you're going to get as of right now that I know of. That's the only identifier you're going to receive on your multifunctional display. You can't name it. It'll come through as an MMSI number, but it'll have that display and mark a waypoint. And I think, although we got rapid at the end there, sorry, I know there's always questions. The one thing I want to just share on the, that'll get distracting, is there's another unit that is not mechanical, that is water activated. So this AIS unit is a transponder, just like the other one. It is water activated, which I don't, it's a little bit bulkier. It's going to fit in a life jacket. And if you get wet, it could go off. So I kind of said you don't want that, but it's your choice. This will be water activated. This does not do DSC calling, but it does transmit AIS. So I think we should open it up there for questions.
Quick question. The Epirbs, if you're in a life raft and you have an Eperb, is that Eperb going to function? Does it have to be in the water tethered to the raft, or can it be in the raft as long as it's upright? What's the feeling about that?
You're definitely going to want the Eperb to be outside of the raft to transmit. You can tie it off to the raft and let it float. And actually, I didn't want to say this earlier, you actually will get a better grounding and probably a stronger signal, so they say. But yeah, you definitely want it outside of the raft.
Will it adequately transmit if it's in the raft, held upright?
I mean, you will have some interference, so I would suggest tying it off. And as you can see on the picture there, there's room for you to be side of the holding it, but tie it off. If it falls out of your hands, at least it'll stay tethered to the life raft.
Yeah, I just think if you had rough seas or something, you wouldn't want to lose that Eperb.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Brian, we do have a couple of questions in the chat box.
All right.
Cindy, I believe your question was probably answered after you wrote it, but I'm going to go ahead and read that to Brian. What would boats receiving the MOB AIS signal see? In other words, what should we be looking for on our AIS if someone nearby is in trouble?
Sure. Yeah, it was answered. The basic rule of thumb is that you're going to see probably the round circle with the X on it. However, if your electronics show an MOB or an AIS transmission different, then you could see a different icon. But overall, you'll see some kind of indicator with Latin long coordinates.
Okay, and the next question is, what are recommended MOB solutions for children who may not be able to activate an AIS or PLB?
Yes, funny that you should say that, because earlier the person that was in here, we were talking, and I suggested that the water activated one would probably be best. But this gentleman said that his boat was what I call like not a wet boat, so they don't tend to get wet. So this unit here, the weather dock, is probably the best idea, because you can still manually activate it, but if the child or person doesn't have the wherewithal of doing that, it will water activate. Again, you want to make sure you tie this off, because it will go in the water in order to water activate, but it's tied off to if it's tied off to a inherently buoyant PFD, it goes in the water, it activates, and this is probably the best solution for a child, but it's also a nice feature that it's water activated.
Yeah, and thanks, Brian. And what is the model of that? The one you're holding up?
It's by Weather Dock, and it's called the Easy One. So all spelled out. I know the lanyards wrap around it. Easy One. And if you go onto YouTube and put in Weather Dock Easy One, there'll be a demo where they throw it into a bowl of water and you see it activated. There's another video where the guy has it in his PFD and he falls in the water and it goes off. So, and then another video where they set this off at a boat show, and you say, how did this affect a VHF radio? It's because that VHF radio is AIS integrated. So this doesn't have DSC calling, which was my question a while ago, is if this doesn't have DSC calling, how did it affect a VHF radio? And it's because that VHF radio has AIS integration.
Great, thanks for answering my question.
Our next question, Brian, is can you discuss the pros and cons of Cat 1 and Cat 2 Epirbs?
Okay, so a category 1 Eperb, which is the automatic deployed, depends on where you put it. So it's nice that it floats free should the vessel sink, but create any kind of scenario in your mind as to what disasters could happen, and can I get to my Eperb on the rail? And if there's a fire, if there's a collision, will I be able to get to my Eperb if my vessel doesn't sink? So it's good to have a category 1 or automatic deployed. Vessel sinks, that Eperb's going to pop up. There's the other disadvantages may be financial. Every 2 years, you're replacing your hydrostatic release so it can float free. So you have more maintenance, so to speak, or more expense as well. So you have to make sure that you replace that hydro every couple years. The advantages of having a category 2 Eperb are it's right there, it's at the ready. You always have access to it because most likely, that ditch bag or the Eperb will be close at hand. So, but they both are, just so I can stress, they're both water activated, they're both manually activated. And so I would think the scenario that you create that could be the worst thing that could happen, can I get to my Eperb? If you're attending to somebody that's hurt or has the potential of loss of life, how am I going to go to the rail to get my Eperb? That's a question to ask yourself as well. I've talked to many Coast Guard and search and rescue personnel, and the one question I've always asked was, if there is a life, at-risk situation, should you set off your Eperb? If somebody goes in the water, should you set off your Eperb? And there's no easy answer. It's either set it off right away or don't set it off right away. Try the VHF Mayday call before. One rescue swimmer said to me, if you set off your Eperb after somebody's been in the water for an hour, the chances of survival are smaller. So set off your Eperb right away, get into contact with, personnel on your VHF radio explaining why you set your Eperb off. So that's a little bit more than you probably asked, but there it is.
Bian says, hi, Brian. I hope I didn't miss this, but I'm interested in what you think about LED flares.
LED flares. So if you can have an LED flare because it meets the requirements. So anybody recreational, you can have an LED flare on board and it counts towards your onboard flare, and then have conventional soulless flares in addition to those, even if they're expired, soulless flares are still going to work. Now, of course, you get into 1 or 2 or 3 generations deep, and now all of a sudden you have a lot of flares on board. Don't go that deep, but to have some recently expired flares on board, soulless flares especially, having them on board is always a good backup to the electrical flare that does cover recreational boating. So I like them. They're visible. The one thing that both a electronic flare does and a normal conventional flare does is, if you're out in the middle of the sea, it stands out without a doubt. If you're having a distress and the coast is your background, from what some harbor masters have said, the background doesn't always necessarily allow any device to stand out. So a strobe, I have heard from rescue swimmers and search and rescue that the strobe is very powerful and very, very visible, and has actually saved lives because of its visibility.
All right, we have one more question here. So while I read this, if anyone else has any questions, please get them in. But this question is, how do you obtain an MMSI number?
So an MMSI number is easily obtained. I think there's a couple channels of pursuing one, but I know for sure Boat US. So I thought there was a second one that I read, but Boat US is the most common. And basically, that's a question for me to also say that I'm trying to integrate this into any of these seminars that I do. And that MMSI number is just as important as the registering your Eperb. Because if you program your MMSI number into your VHF radio and you lift up that little red switch that says, you know, and you can press that emergency button, that is transmitting information that is valuable for search and rescue. So MMSI numbers can be obtained through Boat US, and it's really important that you program your MMSI number into your VHF radio. You press that distress button without an MMSI number programmed in, and nothing's going to happen. So please program your MMSI numbers into your VHF radios.
All right, well, thank you so much, Brian. I don't see, wait, let's see. I think there are just some thank yous here. Here's a comment. If you will sail internationally, it's really important not to get your MMSI from Boat US. They do not get put into the ITU. Only FCC registration does that.
Yes, well, when I was making the slides, I said my audience is probably USA flagged and sailing vessels. So yes, that is true. I took it out because I didn't want to confuse, but yes, if you're international, that is true.
All right, did anyone have any other questions for Brian? I don't see any, Brian, but I want to thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation, lots of great information. And you're getting lots of thank yous, and much appreciated.
Great, well, that's good. I've never done a webinar, and I was a little nervous to do it, but I think it worked out pretty good. So thank you for having me. And if anybody has any questions, I don't know how you can get them my information, but a pretty easy email, Brian, BRIAN @LRSE.com. And I'm always here to answer questions, whatever you need.
All right, well, thanks again, Brian. And you look like an old pro, so I would have never guessed it was your first time.
All right.
Very good.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for attending. And with that, we'll call it a day. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.